unlike NVIDIA and AMD with the RX 7600 XT launch, we're not going to waste anyone's time with bullshit today. The answer is 1 to 3%. That is the percent improvement of the 4080 Super over the original 4080. We spent 20 hours testing and validating that behavior, and now we can produce our one-sentence review, which is 1 to 3% better for the 4080 Super. So thank you everyone for watching, and go to the store to support us. See ya. The only thing good about the 4080 Super, and the only thing worth talking about, is the price. NVIDIA's official price for it's $1,000 now, down from $1,200 for the original 4080, and they are functionally the same card for all intents and purposes. For benchmarking gaming performance, you should think of them as identical. The difference between the two, it basically amounts to noise. Like it wouldn't even show up as meaningful if the test environment isn't clean enough. So if this were still $1,200, the 4080 Super, then the review would probably be about one of the most aggressive reviews we would possibly put together, similar to the 4060 Ti last year, because it would be a massive waste of everybody's time and attention and the same price. But NVIDIA has learned. This time, it launched a boring product with a better price, and that actually genuinely does complicate things a lot. The 4080, as we said in our launch review, was never worth $1,200. It didn't make sense for workstation users like us. Unfortunately, the lack of VRAM, it actually genuinely does matter a lot on the 4080 versus the 4090. So NVIDIA succeeded in creating an actual tiering difference between its top end and its next down, which historically, they were a lot closer than they are today. And because of that, the price has grown, the gulf has grown between them, and that's probably partly because NVIDIA knows that the professional audience really doesn't have many options at the high end. Anyway, the trouble with all of this is that the 4080 never should have been $1,200 to begin with, which does complicate the price drop as well, because it's not as simple as just congratulating NVIDIA and saying, good job, you dropped the price, everybody's happy now. Because they're just kind of bringing it back to maybe closer to expectations. And that makes the price reduction of the 4080 Super feel like some kind of Stockholm syndrome. It is kind of a good thing, and the value certainly improves, but it's also difficult to praise something that has moved from complete insanity to moderately deranged. And that's what we're going to be looking at in the review today. Traditionally, many years ago, the 4080 Super would not exist in this capacity. It would have been a price cut. NVIDIA used to do those more often. We'd get press releases where they'd give us the lineup of their whole GPU stack, normally around or just before or after an AMD GPU launch. Intel wasn't in it at the time. And the news was, hey, the price cut improves the value, and that was about it. It was not as often a new card as we get today. So taking this approach means that NVIDIA gets to strap a sticker to the end of the existing card with functionally the same performance, again, in ways where the changes are not meaningful, and generate some buzz. Clearly it's working. We're talking about it. Probably a lot of other people are too, because it's a new card, rather than just doing the price cut where it gets covered in news and everyone kind of moves on. So they're definitely adapting the strategy. Anyway, let's review this card. This review won't be like any of our other GP reviews for the last few weeks. So we've done massive amounts of charts. Some of these reviews were like 30, 40 charts. To really prove the work and show how things have changed. But because this one is so simple, we are keeping the review very simple, and we're going to boil it down to really just a few metrics here and some general industry discussion. So this, just to prime everyone, is a little less structured for the amount of data. If you want it, there's a few ways you can get it. One, we're going to just publish all the charts in a mega charts thing on the website. That'll contain the 4080 Super data on it on gamersnexus.net. We'll run a separate video to do a bunch of other updates when that happens. You can get it there if you really want the raw absolute FPS numbers. The other option you have, and this is a sincere recommendation from me, is you can go to any one of our charts, the 4080 published in the last couple weeks, and you can multiply the number FPS that the 4080 is against 1% if you want the low end, or 3% if you want the upper bound. You add them together, and there's your difference. So that would be how you could quickly calculate it. And yes, it really is that simple. At 1080p, sure, you might have some truncation from CPU bottlenecks or whatever, but it doesn't really matter because we're talking 1 to 3%. Okay, so instead of going completely ham and doing all the latency, efficiency, and everything else that we were originally planning to do, let's just get straight into kind of the recap of everything. Here's the specs. The 4080 Super, as a reminder, has 10,240 CUDA cores and uses a perfect 8103 die. The original 4080 was also 8103, but it was cut down from 9728 CUDA cores. This could have been for yield reasons. There's also obviously some natural product segmentation built into this as well, but normally the yields improve as the process matures, and so it's not uncommon for a GPU manufacturer to open up the die a little more. The end result is that the new 4080 Super has 5.3% more CUDA cores, but it also has an advertised clock bump. It's just very slight. And here's the chart to join the recap. We could spend 30 minutes chart spamming to show our work like normally, but this one really just doesn't deserve it, and no one should watch that anyway. So this summarizes it pretty well. Genuinely, you could multiply any of these percentages against the 4080 results on a chart from a week ago, as long as you know which one you're looking at, and you get a rough idea for where it lands. With the 4070 Ti Super launch and the relative lameness of that card, we said it seemed possible that NVIDIA was couching its weakest launch between its two better cards, the 4070 Super and, we thought, the 4080 Super. For performance, that speculation didn't pan out, unfortunately for the 4080 Super and our interest levels in testing it. But the value is actually better, and so that's what makes this anything worth talking about at all, as we've said. However, the original assumption that the 4070 Ti would be the most boring one, that was incorrect. It might actually be this one, just from raw performance. Anyway, back to that 4080 versus 4080 Super chart. We weren't expecting a world of change with the specs change, but we were expecting a little better than an average uplift of, say, 1.9%. Here's a quick comparison of the RX 7900 XTX versus the 4080 Super. First, showing only ray tracing and isolation because the advantage flips, and the favor is toward NVIDIA here, whereas the raster favor is toward AMD. In this chart, we see the unbelievable lead NVIDIA holds in Cyberpunk ray tracing, which we just re-added to the test suite when running Ultra RT settings. And then there's a disproportionate advantage that falls as RT settings are reduced. We see this with medium going from a 60+% NVIDIA favor to about a 30% favor. Still huge at rough price equivalent, but it's a big difference. And Dying Light 2 shares at least the medium sort of percentages. Resident Evil favors AMD here and is a lighter RT workload, so that makes sense. Tomb Raider and F1 are also both medium to lightweight RT workloads, and that gives us a fairly full picture of the types of RT games right now. We have those which heavily leverage ray tracing and swing the performance towards NVIDIA in big ways, and we have those which supplement more and impact it less heavily. Here's the rasterization comparison between these two. AMD leads or is equal with the 4080 Super. Overall, it's anywhere from about, again, equal to 20% ahead in raster performance, with particular strengths in Starfield at 4K, Dying Light 2 at 4K, Resident Evil at 4K in our testing, F1 at 4K as well, and 1440p. That's actually not bad at 1080p for that one, despite approaching bottlenecks. If you mostly play non-ray tracing titles, or you aren't interested in using the feature in heavy RT games like Cyberpunk and Alan Wake 2, then the 7900 XTX might be better value, but it really just depends what kind of games you want to play on your card. One additional note here too, for F1 and Total War, the 1080p result would also increase similarly to the 1440p result, but it gets truncated because we start running into external bottlenecks at this class of card. That makes sense. So let's talk about that aspect. That's the most interesting thing today anyways, the value. We don't normally do FPS per dollar or dollar per FPS charts for a few reasons. They're definitely useful. It's just that they require some caveating and they aren't quite as objective as we'd like them to be. Number that comes out of the end of it is somewhat useless. You don't really care about the dollar number. You care about how big is that bar compared to the other bars. And we'll talk about that more later in this review at the end. But a lot of you request these and they definitely have their place, and this is the place. Just doing especially a head-to-head with cards that are relatively close in price. So one other note here too is that these types of charts shed all of the nuance. So any discussion about potential efficiency, power efficiency, professional workloads, frame pacing and frame delivery, you lose all of that here, where you would have at least the frame pacing and say an average to 0.1% lows chart, but still useful. It's a different type of chart for us. Let's try it out. Here's 1440p for the 4080 versus 4080 Super. If we were to draw a line at an approximate average, it'd be in the $8 to $9 per FPS range for the original 4080, 6.5 to 7.5 for the 4080 Super. Generally speaking, you can see from the gap that the 4080 to 4080 Super, where lower is better, improves by a similar amount per card. And again, the actual dollar number doesn't really matter because the FPS is just, you make it basically whatever you want depending on the games, but the difference is what matters, and it's improved. For perspective, let's look at these numbers as a percent reduction in cost per frame. This is just the percent improvement, where we're defining improvement as reduction in cost per frame from the 4080 to the 4080 Super. The reduction in USD per FPS tends to be about 17%. So if you wanted an objective look at the change in value, or at least as much of an objective look as we could get, which inherently has some subjectivity to it depending on the buyer's situation, this is about as close as we'll be able to do it between two cards. Just a quick fun point here too to make an example of marketing math. Depending on if you are NVIDIA or a normal human, you could say it's 17% better than the 4080, or you could say it's 1 to 3% better, obviously, depending on which of those metrics you want to promote. As we said earlier, this entire launch is functionally just a price reduction of an existing product. It's a good thing to reduce the price. They've done it in a little bit of a confusing way with all the different names that are out there now. And we wonder whether the cost to fab a cut down 4080 die is meaningfully lower than the new 4080 Super die. Because if it is, and if we ignored NVIDIA's desire for maintaining ASP and margin, then it might have been more exciting to cut the MSRP further. Doesn't normally work that way though. Then it'd look like an admission of a bad launch price. It would reduce the average selling price, and so maybe that was never in the cards. As we said last year, NVIDIA had an RTX 4080 problem where no one was buying them for some time. It's kind of the opposite of the 4090, which everyone seems to want. The GPU market has definitely changed in that regard, but let's look at some more numbers. The next ones look at the 7900 XTX. We're also using 1440p for these. We have 4K numbers, of course, but 1440 allows us to pretty much show anything. And we're showing off an average of a selection of cards available at retailers. This table shows our work for picking the price when we do the price performance comparisons. Currently, the average 7900 XTX will cost about $985 in the US from the two largest retail options. The cheapest option yesterday was the Phantom Gaming at $940, which seems to be in good supply. It's tough to know which price to use for the chart coming up since the instant promos are likely temporary and to compete with this launch. So to simplify things, we'll make them more complicated. So what we do best, we'll use the best price and the average price. That's $940 and $985. And remember that the average 4080 Super is likely to trend above $1,000 as well, but they don't exist when we're filming this. Here's the price per frame chart. We have two values for the 7900 XTX to make the comparison. First, looking at RT performance, particularly in Cyberpunk with ultra settings, AMD is getting killed for value, but that was expected because if you remember, this specific test produces massive double-digit percentage point increases with NVIDIA over AMD. The medium results are less intensive for the ray tracing workload again, and as a result, the numbers leveled out. NVIDIA still produces a better value per frame though. In Dying Light 2, NVIDIA again maintains an advantage against both AMD price points. Resident Evil favors AMD, F1 with RT marginally favors NVIDIA, and Tomb Raider with RT has them about equal. Now if we look at rasterization performance, AMD generally has an advantage. It's typically below or roughly equal to NVIDIA in the games that are in the bottom half of the chart for rasterization. AMD's performance is typically higher in these, not always, or it's very close, and so that's benefiting it for the value in these versus some of those RT benchmarks. Here's the percent reduction in cost per frame with RT moving to the 4080 Super from the XTX. At $985 for the XTX, the reduction in cost per FPS for the 4080 Super, despite a higher base cost, is 38% for Cyberpunk with Ultra RT, 20% at medium, or in Dying Light, 9% for F1 and 5% for Tomb Raider. AMD has an advantage in our Resident Evil tests. At $940, those numbers reduced to 35%, 16%, 4.5% in Equality and Tomb Raider. Let's look at the rasterization and flip the chart because the XTX tends to be better in these tests. The reduction in cost per FPS now favors AMD. Buying AMD instead of NVIDIA here would give you a 15% lower cost per frame at $940 in Starfield, Resident Evil 4, 20% in F1, 17% in Total War. NVIDIA has a driver overhead advantage in our testing approach for Final Fantasy XIV, so it levels out there. And the $985 options lose some of that value advantage, of course, but you'd still need to determine if they have features you value more than the 45 bucks. And they're still ahead of NVIDIA there. So that's some new ways to maybe visualize the data. You can let us know what you think of it. A lot of people request these. We've done them a couple times in the past, but always have to explain a couple of reservations we have because, well, actually this next chart is an even better representation of it. So we're gonna look at NVIDIA's progress on value. And the chart we're gonna show, it's functionally a similar concept of the value calculation, but it's useful because we're gonna look at NVIDIA's full current lineup, and what we're looking to identify is, has it improved? So as at a glance as possible, is NVIDIA actually moving in the right direction, or does it just kind of feel like it, or are we being Stockholm syndromed into thinking they're moving in the right direction? This chart kind of helps answer that question more objectively. Couple notes here. So price per frame value like this gets fuzzy when you exit direct head-to-head comparisons and you do kind of a wide band chart of everything. And that's for reasons we explained earlier, but our main reservations about this kind of chart are how people actually shop, which I'll talk about. Another one, this is me just kind of explaining it to you all because these are not charts we typically show. They're highly requested. They're kind of interesting. We think there's usefulness there. I don't know if we're going to use them in reviews ever again. Kind of depends what people think. But whenever we introduce something new, we like to explain our thought process to how we got to the chart and what our problems with it are out of full transparency. So one of the other issues that I have with these types of charts is it's an abstraction away from an abstraction away from an abstraction away from the base metric of time. So if we're looking at percent value, which is kind of based, well, is directly based upon the cost per frame per second metric, which is based on frames per second, which is an abstraction itself away from time, frame time. It's so many steps that if you think about it too hard, it starts to mean nothing. And but it's fun, and maybe you'll find it useful. We tried to do our best here to meet the audience demand for this type of thing. As for how people actually shop, generally speaking, people have a budget in mind or they're determining it, and then they'll buy within a range, roughly. That means a head-to-head chart is definitely useful for value, but very few people would say, I only want to buy the best dollar per frame card, ignore all other nuance, and then pick whatever has the best value on a chart, because it's probably going to end up being like a $300 card, and it doesn't normally work that way. Now, these charts also smooth over nuances, so that means, again, we lose frame pacing, we lose the frame buffer potential advantages, things like that. And one last thing, too, just to note that the dollars are not cross-comparable at all between reviews, certainly, and even necessarily within a review. They're kind of really only just work on the same chart, and that's because they're basically arbitrary. It's not like frame rate or temperature or something where there's some kind of threshold of objectively below this number is not tolerable, and it completely changes based on the math you put into it, of course. If you have 800 FPS, totally different number. Anyway, our pricing here was taken by averaging reasonable cards available for each of NVIDIA's SKUs, and the 4090, when we checked, was not available for MSRP, unfortunately. The average price appeared to be about $2,000. So that's what we used for this one. One other reservation about this chart. This is just my TED talk about the challenges with making charts that are kind of abstractions for things like value. But these charts also skew heavily, depending on whether you're using 4K, 1440, 1080, not even necessarily just because of bottlenecks that might start appearing at lower resolutions, but more importantly, because the percent scaling of performance changes, where you'll see some cards do a lot better, a lot worse at, say, 4K than at 1080. And so depending on, the charts kind of smooth over that too. So anyway, you understand our reservations about them, and they are many, but let's just get to the damn chart because that's what people want. And I do think they can have value. Anyway, here it is. This is new. Again, we're not sure if we like it. That's your disclaimer. No big claims for this one. It might go away in the future, but we might also rework it. 100% is baseline best value of the cards presented on this chart, where value is determined as the dollar per FPS number. The result has the 4060 as the cheapest per FPS, so it's at 100%. The 4090 is about half the quote-unquote value of that, if we want to make the decision as a community to phrase it that way. And one of those major nuances is the fact that a 4060, for example, could never do some of the things a 4090 could do, and you can't really represent that here. But regardless, what this does is tell us the direction NVIDIA is going. By this chart, it would in fact appear that the 4080 Super's new price drop has improved its quote-unquote value. The 4080 is among the worst on the chart, and lacks some of those nuances that a 4090 provides. For instance, despite being a so-called low value by this chart, the 4090 is still the only one on this list that we would buy for our editing machines due to the VRAM. And that's not something that gets measured here. Anyway, it's kind of a lot of talk about just, we're playing around with charts, numbers, and ideas because the audience is constantly providing concepts for new things. We've debuted a lot of them recently. It's fun to do, and we just bake it into reviews at this point. But anyway, the takeaway here, strictly from the perspective of, is NVIDIA making things better value or not? At least for the 4080 Super, it appears to be yes. And even if you just remove all of this and look at the fact that the price came down $200, but it's basically the same product, the answer is yes. We don't really need the chart to prove that. What's more interesting is looking at things like the 4070, the 4070 Super, and the TI Super to try and gauge value there. And generally speaking, as you go up the stack, the value tends to get worse. That's historically been true. The 4070 Super helped to revive some of that. The TI Super, unfortunately, was a bit of a dud. And the 4080 Super, we come back to the same thing from the very beginning, which is it's cheaper. None of the playing around with charts and numbers and trying to do something interesting, using the review as an opportunity to explore different presentation methods, none of it changes the fact that the only other alternative here for charts would be 30 minutes of me losing my mind increasingly, probably using an increasing amount of and stronger grade of adjectives to describe the 4080 Super's performance, such as, for example, mind-blowing, 1.923678% improvement, which is one of the biggest percent improvements we've ever seen if you ignore the decimal. That's the kind of commentary you lose, but no one needs 30 minutes of that. So the price came down. The only factor at this stage that we are considering is basically that. The 7900 XTX is now effectively the direct alternative to the 4080 or 4080 Super, where previously the XTX was cheap enough at that $200 drop, typically sometimes more, where you might not even be a customer if you were trying to spend $1,000 and not $1,200, because that's a big increase. In this case, we can't praise NVIDIA for basically doing what it should have done a long time ago. We can, however, say that this is a better situation. Our hesitation, again, to fully embrace the product kind of goes back to not getting suckered into believing this is kind of the new method for keeping the average prices high. But it's at least improved. Now, all that said, one thing we noticed as a positive in our efficiency testing of the 7600 XT review was that the 4080 had we had a newfound appreciation for it, where previously we had very little, at least based on the original kind of review performance numbers, products at the time it came out. But the newfound appreciation was specifically for efficiency, where in terms of performance per watt, or however you want to look at that, the 4080 was actually impressive. And the 4080 Super is basically the same thing here, just a little bit better still. So that's something that our review overhauls are helping us see, which is pretty cool. Anyway, that's it for now. You have enough to work with and make your decisions. It's the same thing but cheaper, and we'll publish as many of the raw FPS numbers as we can get together in our next Mega Charts update. But this was kind of just a way for us to recap and cool down and come to the end of this massive review cycle where we've done, is this the fourth GPU? I guess this is the fourth GPU. And then the 2 CPUs, and we have more CPUs coming in. But we're at the end of it. That's your kind of big picture overview of how NVIDIA is doing in the market. And thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersaccess.net to support us directly. Go check out the AMD staff video from yesterday. Super cool stuff. A lot of discoveries in there that are really interesting. And we'll see you all next time.